I'm going to go over everything from the gear, different types of machines, how to strike an arc, proper welding technique for different types of electrodes. It's all going to be in this video. And if you're looking for more stick welding videos or more in-depth welding tips, be sure to check out the other videos on my channel and subscribe for future content. I'm going to have a lot of stick welding videos coming out that are going to go deep into all of the aspects and some of the tricks that I've learned over the years. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's talk about some of the gear that you need. So the first is a welding helmet or welding hood, and I'd highly recommend getting an auto darkening welding hood because it's hard enough to learn to weld when you can see the end of your electrode before you strike an arc. It's even harder when you can. The next is a set of welding gloves, just some good heavy leather welding gloves. I'll link these in the description below, the ones that I typically buy, but you know, there's all sorts, and they mostly work pretty good. The next is a welding jacket, and you know, you can probably get away without having one of these depending on what you wear, but for me it's definitely worth it, right? And there's a couple different kinds that I wear. This is the cotton kind. I always wear this pretty much when I'm TIG welding and usually MIG welding, and if I'm stick welding like on a bench or below me and there's not a lot of sparks hitting me, they are flame resistant and they work pretty well. But if I'm doing something a little more involved, I'll wear this leather coat, and it's really good to keep you from getting all the burns. I mean, I've had this since it was brand new. You can see all these black marks on here. I mean, that would have been my arm if I hadn't been wearing it. So if you're going to be doing a lot of heavy stuff, you're welding overhead or different positions like that, I think these are definitely worth having. The next thing is a chipping hammer, because when you weld with stick welding, it leaves a coating on top of the weld called slag, and you have to get that off. And the way you do it is with the chipping hammer. So there's these inexpensive chipping hammers like this, and this is what I've always used, and they work just fine. I actually just got today a new one that I ordered yesterday online, and I'm going to try it out and see how it works, and I'll let you know when we do some welding and see if it's an improvement over the old style. So far it feels really good in my hand, so I'm excited to try that out. The last thing that you'll need is a wire brush to get the last bit of the slag off, and that's really important, especially if you're going to be welding multiple passes. So you run a weld, and then if you run more welds over it to make a larger weld, you'll definitely want to brush the last bit of that slag out so it doesn't get caught in the middle of your weld. So wire brush is definitely a must-have. You don't need one of these, but an angle grinder with a wire wheel on it, this can just save a ton of time over brushing by hand. So I usually get one of these wire wheels and put it on the angle grinder. So that's some of the gear that you'll need. I'll put some links down below, so check those out to get a little more detail on the types of things that I use. Now I'm going to talk about the different types of welding machines that you might buy for stick welding. There are really only 3 different types, and I have one of each here in my shop. So let's start with this. This is a classic. It's a Lincoln AC225, and it's an example of a transformer machine, and they're often called a buzz box because they make a buzzing sound when you turn them on. And they're really simple and robust. There's not a lot inside of these to go wrong. It's really a couple of coils of wire and a couple of switches, and so the only setting on this right here is to change current, and that's pretty much it, and it's ready to go. Now, one of the drawbacks to these is they typically only output alternating current. Though they have a direct current or DC model, most of them are just an AC model. And the reason why that can be a drawback is some electrodes don't run very well with alternating current. They're designed for direct current. And also, you can get a little bit more spatter, but from my experience running these welders, they run really smooth, they're really robust. One other drawback is you can see the size is pretty large, so they can be big and heavy, so if you don't have a lot of space, that might be a limitation for you. They also only run on 240 volts, so if you don't have a 240 volt outlet in your garage, it's pretty limited what you can do with one of these old transformer type machines. Next, let's talk about inverter machines, and the next 2 we're going to talk about are inverters. The first one is this little Deco Pro. It's a small welder that I picked up just to have something portable for small jobs. Now, this was really inexpensive as far as welders go. It was just over $100. I ordered online. I'll put a link down below in the description, and it's been a good machine. The inverters typically output direct current or DC, so you can use them with all sorts of rods, and they just run pretty well. Now, I don't know that they will last as long as a transformer welder, right? This is something that your grandkids might still have in their garage, but you know, for the price and the performance you get out of them, they're really quite good. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is my TIG welder, and almost all TIG welders can stick weld as well. And so if you're looking for you know, a higher end machine, you can get either a multi-process MIG or a TIG welder that also has a stick functionality. And you might wonder, why would you want to stick weld if you have a TIG or a MIG welder in the shop? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One is it's very portable. You don't have to take your big gas cylinder with you. You can do it pretty much anywhere just by taking the machine, a couple of leads, and some electrodes with you. The second is that you can get a little bit heavier weld, especially if you're welding on thick material that might have a little mill scale or it might be dirty. It's less sensitive to that than TIG welding is. So there's a few reasons you might want to weld with that. And some of the advanced features that you have on a machine like this, or you would have on a higher end inverter stick welder, are different input voltages. So either of these can run on both 120 volts or 240 volts. So you can use it at higher power where that's available, or it's portable. So if you go to help someone out and all they have is a 120 volt outlet, you can just use that. Also, there's a feature on this called dig. Others call it arc force, and what that'll do is it'll increase the current if you push your electrode down in really close to your part, and that can help with certain welding techniques to make them a little easier to do. One other feature that none of these machines have, but you might want to look for if you're looking for a higher end machine, is called hot start. And what that does is right after you strike an arc, it'll increase the welding current for just a few seconds, or less than a second often, and then drop it down to your welding current. And that helps a little bit when you're learning and just getting started, as well as just getting a nice crisp start while not overheating the rest of your weld. So those are a few features to look for on machines. These are the types of machines that you can check out, and you can often find you know, machines like this on the classified ads if you're looking for a used machine, or inexpensive machines like this, or higher end inverters if you want to make that investment. Okay, next we're going to talk about the electrodes, or the welding rods. And so it's called stick welding because you weld with a stick. And the way these are made is the center is a core made out of your filler material, usually it's steel, and they're coated on the outside with flux. And the reason for that is the flux keeps the molten metal, after you melt it, from contacting the oxygen in the air and contaminating it. Also, the coating on there can add more filler metal, and it can stabilize the arc to make it a little easier to weld. And so there's different types of welding electrodes out there, and they're designated by a 4-digit number. And the first 2 digits indicate the strength of it. So in this case, this is 70, or the first 2 digits, 70, and so it's 70,000 pounds per square inch is the strength of the metal after it's welded. The next number indicates what welding position you can use it in. So these have a 1, and you're probably just going to want to get ones that have a 1 in the 3rd digit, because they can be used in all positions. Welding electrodes that have a 2 deposit a lot of material, and it'll drip down if you try to weld vertically or overhead, so you can really only weld flat or horizontal with those. And then the last number indicates the overall type. And we'll just talk about 3 types, and these are the 3 types that you'll want to be aware of as you get started, and I'll tell you where you might want to use them. But before we talk about that, let's talk about sizes. So this is the same type of electrode in 3 different sizes. This is 1/16 of an inch, 3/32 of an inch, and 1/8 of an inch. And if you're mostly going to be welding material that's around 1/8 of an inch thick, you'll probably want to get 3/32 of an inch electrodes. Will work pretty well for you. If you're going to be welding thicker material, like a 1/4 inch or thicker than that, you'll probably want 1/8 inch electrodes. They'll deposit a little bit faster and save you a little time as far as that goes. So those are the sizes you'll probably want to look at. Now let's talk about the different types. The first type we'll talk about is a general all-purpose electrode called 6013. And this is really good for repairs. It's pretty tolerant of dirty or rusty material. You should always clean it off, but you can't always get everything, and so it's pretty good for that. It's also good for just general fabrication. It's pretty easy to run, so it's not a bad all-around rod if you're just going to have one in the shop. The next one we'll talk about is 6011, and this one and the one we'll talk about after this are the most common used in industry for fabrication. 6010 is almost the same as 6011 that we're talking about here, and it's really good for running a first pass. If you're going to run multiple passes on a weld, so you run one weld and stack others on top of it, this is the one to use for your first weld. Also, if you're welding thinner material, there's a technique that you can use with the 6011 that you weld and then you move forward and back over and over again, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that lets you weld that without burning all the way through. So that's a good choice to use there. The last one is 7018, and this runs the nicest, smoothest beads that you can get, and it's good for heavier fabrication if you're going to be doing a little bit thicker stuff. In industry, it's often called low-high for low hydrogen, and you have to keep it in an oven and do some things if you're welding certain alloys of steel and certain thicknesses. There you need to do that, but around the shop, it's just really good to have around for running a nice smooth bead, and we'll demonstrate how you do that in a minute here. So with all of these electrodes, one of the main things you're going to want to do is you want to store them so they don't get damaged and they stay dry. And I like to use these canisters like this, and I'll put a link down in the description to some of these. It's just a nice way to keep your electrodes safe and dry, and they usually have a divider in the middle here so you can have multiple types, as well as a seal right here to help keep them dry. So, you know, just a little tip for you. You might want to have a nice place to keep those. I've seen other people make their own canisters out of PVC pipe, so there's other options there as well. So one last note when it comes to electrodes and machines. If you only have an AC or alternating current machine, then you need to make sure if you buy 7018 that you get 7018 AC. It's a special version to run AC. Also, 6011 and 6013 will both run on AC or DC. So you should be good with any of these three electrodes as long as you get the version that's made for AC. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about how to set up for stick welding. So the first thing you have is your work clamp, or a lot of people will call it a ground clamp. You can call it either one, is just fine. And you use this to complete the circuit. So you'll connect it either directly to the part that you're working on, or I'll often just connect it to a table. Directly to the part is preferred, but not essential. And then you have right here your electrode holder, or your stinger, a lot of people will call it. And the way that a lot of these work is there's a spring clamp right here, and you can slide the electrode in like this to set up to weld. Now, when you're doing this, there are a number of different grooves in here, so you can put it at whatever angle is comfortable. Sometimes you'll want to put it up like this, and I'll often do that if I'm welding vertically uphill, right? And so sometimes you might want to put it back like this, or even straight out the end. It has a groove for that, whatever makes you comfortable. Now you might be wondering, what if I don't have this kind and I want it to be facing another direction? What you can do is you can slide it in, because there are others that only face one direction, like that, and then you just can bend the rod like that and put it whatever direction you want. So a number of different ways that you can do that. So now that you're set up, let's talk about the first thing that you'll need to do, and that's to strike an arc. Now I'm set up here with the Lincoln AC225 set to 75 amps and 3/32 of an inch 6013 rod, and that's what we'll be using for this tacking exercise here. So when you're striking an arc, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure and get comfortable, right? And so you're in control. And so when I first started welding and I went to trade school to learn to weld, I decided I'm going to do all of this just with one hand and freehand everything. And sometimes you have to do that because you're upside down or in a corner, and that's what you have to do. But wherever you can use another hand to brace, I quickly learned that it's worth doing, because you'll just have a better product and your weld will be there forever. So I like to prop up and brace like this and get comfortable. So this is the position I usually like to get in, especially if I'm welding flat on a bench, and I'll just use this arm here. And as I weld, this electrode will be consumed into the weld and it'll get shorter. And so I'll just use this slot to kind of show how that looks. Right, so I'm using my other arm here to stabilize, and you weld along and you can just kind of collapse down into the plate in a motion like that. Right, so now that you're set up like that, you're ready to strike an arc. And there's a couple ways to do it. One, you can just tap the electrode like that and then pull back, and that'll strike an arc. That's not the way that I do it, but it works for a lot of people. The main thing with that is you need to tap and pull back quickly, but not too far. The other way is you can slide and strike like a match, right? And so if you slide like that, and this is what I do, you strike just a little bit and then pull back and form an arc. And when you're welding, you'll want to keep your arc really short and your welding rod in, but right after you strike the arc, just hold it long for a second and let everything heat up, and it'll run a lot better. So set up like this, strike like a match, and hold it there for just a second, and you'll be ready to go. Let's check out how it's done. So watch as I'm welding here. I'll strike up an arc, and just for a split second I'll hold the arc long, and then I'll be down and into my weld and ready to go. So the first step when you're learning to stick weld is get to where you can strike an arc over and over again very easily without really thinking about it. And once you can do that, you're ready to move on. But I'd keep practicing that just on a piece of plate until you feel comfortable. Now, a quick tip for you, when you're welding, and you go to strike up an arc the second time with an electrode, what will happen is the rod in the middle will burn back up inside of the flux, and so it'll be like a little tuber on the outside, and then you won't be able to strike up an arc with that. And with some kinds of electrodes, especially 7018, that can be pretty hard. So if you just keep a file on hand, you can take that and knock the end off, and then you'll be ready to get a nice crisp start. Now I'm going to show you how to tack your project together. Tack welding is where you make very small welds, usually at the corners, to hold your project in place and make sure you get everything lined up before you put the strong structural welds on. And they're really nice because you can break them off or cut them easily if something isn't quite right. So I'll be tacking up a T-joint right here like this. And when doing this, especially when you're starting out, if you're trying to hold things in place when you tack, then you're left to do it one-handed, and you can do that, especially with practice, but it's really nice to have a variety of different types of clamps. One that's pretty handy are these little angle magnetic clamps like that. See, and I can line this up to hold the T-joint pretty much in place for me. Another neat little one is a type of third hand, they're often called. It's called a grasshopper right here, and it has magnets on the base and then a spring clamp, and you can put it down and hold things in place just like that, and that's really handy. So I'll link those down below. Definitely not a necessity, but it can help out quite a bit. And the nice thing when you use a clamp like this to hold different parts of your project in place is when you go to tack, you want to have a really precise angle on this and be really in control. You can, of course, while you're wearing your glove, hold the electrode right down here and just guide it right into place, right like that. And that can make it a little easier, especially when you're starting out. So definitely something to check into. Now, once you, when you're tacking things together, what you want to do is strike an arc and then move back and forth between the two plates just a little bit until you can see that they're fused together, and then pull out of it. So I'll show you how to do that now. Alright, now when it comes to welding technique, there are really three things that matter with any welding process, and they're all the same. We'll talk about them one by one. So you can practice these things, focus on them one by one in the order that I go over them, and you'll be welding like a pro in no time. So the first thing to pay attention to is your arc length. And you want to make sure and hold a nice tight arc. And almost to the point that it feels like you're gonna drag the electrode. You don't want it to stick, but you want to hold it in there nice and tight. And the best tip that I can give for that is just make sure and do some dry runs And as you go in and your electrode burns off, are you going to be able to move, or are you going to kind of get bound up trying to go around a corner or something and not get in there, and you might need a reposition? Because what will happen is you'll be going around, and if you can't move in physically, then you'll start burning your rod back and your arc will get long, and the quality of your weld will go down. So that's the first thing to pay attention to as you run some practice beads. Make sure you're holding a nice tight arc. The second thing is your angles. And angles are really important in stick welding. And so there's really two angles that you need to pay attention to. One is your work angle. So let's say I was welding these two plates together. This is called a fillet weld here in the corner. And let's say I was doing this fillet weld sitting here on the bench. I would want to have my electrode coming in right around 45 degrees. I usually drop it just a little bit so it biases that top plate just slightly. But you'll be wanting to sit somewhere like that. That's called your work angle. Now if I was welding something flat, or if this joint were like this, I'd want to be coming straight in and out of it like that. Or if I was welding two plates that were tucked up against each other on the bench, I'd want to be straight up and down like that in the direction perpendicular to where I'm traveling. Now the other angle is your travel angle, and as I'm welding along here, I'm going to want to have that dragging by about 10 degrees. And what I mean by drag is it's pointing backwards as I move along. So I want it to be there. The third thing is your movement. And really for most stick welding, especially if you're running the 60-13 or the 70-18 rods that we talked about, you're just going to want a nice, smooth, steady movement along there. And you'll want to maintain a consistent travel speed, or the speed that you're moving along your plate. And that'll give you a nice smooth bead. Now if you're running the 60-11, you can run just what we call a stringer bead like that, where you're running right along, or you can do a technique that's called a whip and pause technique, where you'll move the electrode forward about 1/8 of an inch and then back into the puddle, and forward about 1/8 of an inch and back into the puddle. And so those are the different movements that you can do as you weld. So I'll just show you real quick how each of these different rods run. So first I'm going to run some 70-18, and I'm running this at 115 amps, 1/8 inch 70-18 on a DC inverter machine, and you can see it runs nice and smooth. And after the weld is run, I'll use that new chipping hammer that I picked up, and the slag just scrapes off nice and easy. Next I'm going to run the 60-11, and I'll start out by running a stringer bead with it. And you can see the 60-11 is typically a rod that tends to penetrate and cut really deep. It has an aggressive arc, right? And so you can see some spatter coming off of here running a stringer bead. So I'll move to the whip and pause technique I talked about before, where I'm moving in and out, forward and back in the puddle. And as I do that, it gives a little bit of time for the weld pool to cool, and then I make a series of ripples like that. And that's running pretty well here. Now cleaning the slag off 60-11 is a little bit more challenging. It's a little more crusty and flaky. It takes some brushing and whatnot. Next I'm going to run 60-13 with the Lincoln AC225 buzz box, and it's running really nice here. I'm just running a nice consistent stringer bead, and finish up I'll just grab that new chipping hammer and scrape some of that slag off here, and it's cleaned up and ready to go. So I got a pretty good result with each of those three electrodes. So thanks for tuning in. Again, my name's Tim.